Hello, and welcome to a brand new day of free-to-play here on Magic the Gathering Arena. Get the dish on the latest with me, Lord Rumfish. So, this is black for Murders at Karlov Manor. This is the next part in the Deckbuilding Toolbox series. We've already covered colorless, white, and blue. After this, we'll do red, green, and multicolored. And just real quick, the purpose of the guide is to offer you a glimpse into what cards might be useful in your collection for building a wide variety of different decks. I'm not trying to point you to a specific deck so much, but there are some kernels of deck ideas buried in here as we go along. Let's go ahead and get started. Case of the Gorgon's Kiss. So when this case ETBs, you destroy up to one target creature that was dealt damage this turn. So works pretty well if you're attacking with a bunch of small expendable creatures. Probably a little bit easier to do this in limited. You can't always guarantee there's going to be something to trade of the opponents. They might not even play creatures. In order to solve this, 3 or more creature cards are put into graveyards from anywhere this turn. And that's not that difficult to do, right? You can engineer a situation in Constructed where you're discarding creatures, where you're milling yourself, and as long as you hit 3 creature cards in the same turn, on your turn, then it'll solve. And this thing turns into a 4/4 Gorgon with Death Touch and Lifelink. So, as long as you could turn this on easily enough, then you get a creature that's far above rate for 1 mana. If you can engineer this, then I think that's absolutely got potential, to do good things in Standard. Obviously a 1 mana 4/4 Death Touch Lifelinker is worth playing. So the only question is if you can turn this thing on easily enough. Fester Leech. This is a zombie leech, 1/1 for 1 black. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you mill 2 cards. That's not a May ability. And you can, for a black and a colorless, pump it +2/+2 until end of turn. You can only activate it once per turn. So, this can be an aggressive way to fill up your graveyard. I think it's kind of borderline whether this might be playable or not. The mana-intensive nature of pumping it is a little bit of a problem. But just as with Limited, even in Constructed, the threat of activation might stop the opponent from blocking you. Now, they might block you anyway if they just want to force you to spend your mana. But a lot of times you won't have to pump up the Fester Leech, and your opponent will just let it pass. So this card could be good enough for a deck that wants to mill itself. And it's just an uncommon. Lead Pipe. This is one of the clue equipments. So if you're in a deck that wants artifacts, or that makes clues, or that reduces the activated ability costs on artifacts, and all of those can be done. There's Tezzeret, or there's a rare card in blue that we looked at that reduces activate abilities of artifacts by 1. If you're doing all of that, then there is a chance that a card like this could make it into your standard deck. I don't think it gets there on its own. It definitely needs strong synergies in place before you would consider it. Snarling Gorehound. I think this could get there in Constructed. So you got a 1/1 with Menace for 1 black, that's not bad. It's hard to block. And whenever another creature with power 2 or less ETBs under your control, surveil 1. This, does a lot to set up the top of your deck if you need to hit lands or whatever. It can also fill up your graveyard. Seems like it does good work. Anything like this that's only 1 mana is worth a good long look. 1 mana cards are special in that regard. Even into the Eternal formats, 1 mana cards are always worth a longer look than some of the more expensive cards are. Toxin Analysis is pretty much as like a limited combat trick. Gives Death Touch and Lifelink until end of turn. You investigate. Even though it's only 1 mana, it seems like it's not that easy to engineer a situation in Standard where you want this as a combat trick. Case of the Stashed Skeleton. This one's neat. So you get a 2/1 skeleton, and you suspect it, so it has menace and it can't block. To solve this, you control no suspected skeletons. So either you've removed the suspicion some way, somehow, or more likely the skeleton has died in combat or you've sacrificed it. Once that happens, then you have a sorcery speed Demonic Tutor. Which, Demonic Tutor is a sorcery anyway. It's just that you can't solve this at the end of your turn and then, sacrifice it on the opponent's turn. You have to wait till it comes back. It seems like a pretty cool card. Feels like it could have applications in a bunch of different decks. You could try it in aggro. It's aggressive enough. You could try it in mid-range. You could try it in probably some other builds too, Control doesn't want it so much because it doesn't make a blocker for you. But it is a very interesting card. Anything like this that's low to the ground, has a neat payoff, puts out 2 permanents, could be a pretty good tool in the toolbox. Extract a Confession. This is probably not going to get there in Constructed. It's not embarrassing, but this is no Sheoldred's Edict here. Right? Sheoldred's Edict is instant speed. And you can choose a non-token creature, a token creature, or a planeswalker. This one only does a creature. If you collect evidence 6, it does the creature with the greatest power. And it's at sorcery speed. With all of the good black removal that we have in the format, I don't think you need this one. Homicide Investigator. This one's pretty neat. 2/2 for 2. Whenever 1 or more non-token creatures you control die, investigate. Triggers only once each turn. So I know that there's a 3-mana 1/3 that draws a card when a creature dies, only triggers once a turn. And that would be a better effect, but it also costs 1 more mana to get a 1/3. Right? And this is 2 mana for a 2/2, which is more aggressive. This could go into a human's deck. Could go into detectives if that's a thing. But just generally speaking, seems like you'll get some amount of value off of this card. And it could also trigger some artifact synergies for you. So, all the way around, not bad. You could look at some decks like Rakdos Anvil to see if they want 1 or 2 copies of this. I guess what I'm saying is, it feels flexible. It feels like a pretty good tool to have in the toolbox. Leering Onlooker. This almost feels like it could be constructed playable. 1/3 flyer is a decent blocker. Then it gets value out of the graveyard. which you can do that at instant speed. The bats it makes are tapped, but still the opportunity to do it at instant speed means you can make them at the end of the opponent's turn and then the bats are ready to use. So, you know, it's just an uncommon. If you feel like your vampire deck wants this, or could work for a deck that cares about having a lot of little flying creatures too. Long Goodbye. This one is techie because it can't be countered, but it only hits a creature or planeswalker with mana value 3 or less. There's a lot of great black removal in the format. Since this can't be countered, I could see maybe running a 1 of or a 2 of in some black decks. You know, it helps you get past like Ward on Graveyard Trespasser and some other things. Just remember not to pay the Ward. But I don't think you want too many copies of it, because then you get several of these stranded in your hand when the opponent's got to shoulder it on the battlefield or something. Presumed Dead. Instant. Black and 1. Until end of turn, target creature gets +2/+0 and gains when this creature dies. Return it to the battlefield under its owner's control and suspect it. Alright. So this probably won't see play because if you're trying to scam somebody, you know, with a creature dying and coming back, potentially at a bigger size with like the prototype creatures from Brothers War or some other things like that. There are other cards that do this effect that cost 1 mana. So this one probably doesn't get there. It's interesting that it suspects the creature. That could be a problem if you'd like it to be blocking for you. But I guess if you set it up at the end of the opponent's turn and you do this with like a giant lifelinker. Of course, one of the creatures you would do that with already has Menace. So, yeah, I don't know if there's really a good spot for this card. Repeat Offender. So, you got a 2/1 Human Assassin. It's a common. And you can pay 3, black and 2. If it's suspected, it gets a +1/+1 counter, otherwise you suspect it. So, this card's strong and limited. You know, it's a fantastic mana sink that turns into a game-ending threat. It's probably much too slow for Constructed. I mean, don't get me wrong, I like cards like this that have like a big long-term payoff into the game, but this one's not costed to where it's going to see standard play. Unscrupulous Agent, on the other hand. This is a pretty nice Ravenous Rats here. So, it's an elf and a detective. Now, 1/1 for 2 as always, but when this one ETBs, the opponent exiles a card from their hand, which is better than discarding by a lot. So if this is an effect that you wanted, this is actually a pretty good version of it. So, yeah, if you wanted a Ravenous Rats type thing for an Aristocrats deck, you could do worse than this. Alley Assailant. Another vampire. So we got a 3/3 for 3. ETB's tapped. You can disguise it. Flips up from disguise for 6, which is an enormous cost. And when it turns face up, opponent loses 3, you gain 3. This is just not costed appropriately for constructed play. Cerebral Confiscation. You know, with the existence of Pilfer, that 2 mana, or the bats that are everywhere right now, I'm not sure why you would bump up to this 3 mana card if what you want to do is make them discard 2. There are other cards in our format which have other interesting things that they do, like making a Decayed Zombie token, stuff like that. I just, even with the flexibility on the card, I don't think it's really there. I think there are better options. Clandestine Meddler. Another vampire. You got a 3/2 for 3. When it ETBs, you suspect up to one other creature you control, which is kind of interesting. And whenever one or more suspected creatures you control attack, you surveil one. So, mostly I don't think this is good enough for constructed. What this can do for you is you can get an aggressive start and give something menace that otherwise wouldn't have it. Also, it is a vampire if you have a vampire deck. I don't know if it's good enough to see play in vampires. There might be better things to do with 3 mana in a vampire deck. But it's interesting. Interesting enough that it maybe merits a little bit of consideration. And it's just an uncommon. Haunted Bone Brute. This one, you really don't want to play for its front face. You'd really rather not give the opponent 2 dogs. The only way I could imagine wanting to give the opponent dogs is if Meat Hook Massacre was still legal in Standard. So yeah, this is a 6/2 with Menace. When this dies, each opponent loses 3 life. I did get a surprise kill in Limited from that ability. Flips up from Disguise for a black and 1. It's almost a consideration for constructed. The 2 toughness is really a problem. You know, popping up with 6 power and menace means you very well might get a surprise hit in, especially if the opponent's tapped out. But the upfront cost of having to set up, you know, a disguised creature in the first place is no small thing. So, I really don't know. It is a 6 power thing that can trigger, you know, fight rigging, but there are already other options that are probably better for triggering fight rigging. So, I really don't know that this does much of anything in constructed. Murder Most Foul. I think we already had this card in constructed. There are just better cards like Hero's Downfall, and even Hero's Downfall doesn't see much play. So, Murder is just a long step behind that because it doesn't kill Planeswalkers. Barbed Servitor. So this is a 1/1 for 4. Artifact creature construct. It's indestructible. When it ETBs, suspect it. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card and lose 1 life. It has Menace, so that's more likely to happen. And if they do block it with 2 things, whenever it's dealt damage, target opponent loses that much life. Now, the interesting bit with this card is if you can remove the suspicion from it. Because if this thing can block for you, then you've got like a stuffy doll type of effect. Right? Where if the opponent runs their cards into this, they're going to be losing life. Going to be losing a lot of life. Now, unfortunately, being at 4 mana, setting up a 1/2 punch of removing the suspicion from it might be too slow to really see use in Standard. You could use this in some kind of a weird control deck. You could pair it with Board Sweepers, just don't pair it with like -X, Sacrifice or Exile Board Sweepers. You want to go with straight up destroy effects. As long as you're doing that, then, you know, you could run this alongside Sweepers and you have some kind of a strange control deck at that point. And again, if you can remove the suspicion, this will hold the ground forever. So, yeah, it's a little bit interesting. but I don't know if there's a wide variety of decks that want it. It's pretty clunky. Playing something on 4 that can't block for you and doesn't put much of a clock on the opponent is questionable. But it's not useless, and I see some potential for it. Illicit Masquerade, I think this card is a trap. Let me just tell you straight up. So this card requires a ton of setup. Okay, so this is a flash enchantment for 4. You need creatures that are in play to get imposter counters. Right, and that only happens when you first play this. So that's an issue of timing, where you need things to be in play to stick around and have counters on them. Then you need those things to die. Not get exiled. You need them to die. Then you need creatures in your graveyard to come back to the battlefield. You need all of those things to happen, and you need 4 mana for this Illicit Masquerade. Admittedly, you can do it at instant speed. But this isn't the first time that we've seen payoff cards for, like, your board gets killed. Surprise! Something happens when the board gets killed. Cards like this have been around for ages. You know, like, make a 2/2 zombie for every creature you control that died this turn, or stuff like that. You know, instant speed stuff in, like, white and black. And it pays you back when all your stuff dies, that kind of thing. Now this one could have a little more play to it, because you could just play it at the end of the opponent's turn. And if this situation is already set up, then it has a little bit less of a timing issue than those cards do, because they don't have to die right away. They could die later. The only thing that's stuck in place at the moment you play this is only the things that were in play right then are the ones that get the counters. But I think this card is a terrible trap, and I would not spend your rare wildcards on it. Macabre Reconstruction. 4 mana sorcery, it costs 2 less to cast if a creature is put in your graveyard from anywhere this turn. And you return up to 2 target creature cards from your graveyard to your hand. I think this could actually see play. Because self-mill decks, things like that, could probably get this down to 2 mana with good consistency. Also, if you're just looting, you know, you send a creature card from your hand to the graveyard. Does not seem hard at all to set up a situation where this is a 2 mana draw 2 creatures spell. I don't know if there's a deck in Standard that wants to set that up necessarily at the moment, but I feel like it's a tool. It's a tool that's waiting, ready to use for the toolbox. And it's just a common. So, yeah, I kind of like it. Massacre Girl. Neat card. So, we have a 4/4 for 4, legendary human assassin. She has Menace. Creatures you control have Wither. That's going all the way back to Shadowmoor. And Eventide. So, a source with Wither deals damage to creatures in the form of -1/-1 counters. So instead of dealing damage, it's -1 counters. And on top of that, whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, if its toughness was less than 1, draw a card. That plays well with the Wither, obviously, but it also plays well with spells that deal like -X/-X. So, could this get there in Constructed? Maybe. You know, there's this problem with 4/4s for 4 that seems to plague Standard, right? Where, like, flying creatures. They're like 4/4 flying tramplers for 4. It seems like they never quite get there. Or there's another black legend that costs 4 mana that I love. Her name's Gisa. Gisa exiles your opponent's creatures when they die, and then on your turn, they come back under your control with Decayed. I love Gisa. I think she's a great card. But unfortunately, it's tough to get her to stick around to do her thing. Now, Massacre Girl, I think, has a bit more board impact than Gisa does, because if the opponent's tapped out and they don't have a removal spell right then, their blocks are bad at the point that you play Massacre Girl. Because now any of your trades in combat, things like that, are drawing you cards. So throwing a bunch of 1/1 tokens and stuff in front of your attackers doesn't look so great anymore for the opponent when you play Massacre Girl. And I could see that being more valuable than a card like Gisa. Time will tell. I don't know. I don't know if Massacre Girl's good enough. She might be. We'll see. Night Drinker Moroi. So this one's a good clock in Limited, right? You play this on 3 and then you can flip it up the next turn and start getting in for 4 damage in the air. So for Standard, I think that line is probably too slow. But this one's on the borderline. I'll say as far as the disguise creatures go, this one's a little closer than some of the other ones are. If you could actually chip in for 4 flying damage a turn, and not get this thing removed, that would be a pretty good clock. It would be just about worth the investment of mana. There's probably still better things you could be doing, but there's a very outside chance that maybe this could do something for you. Rot Farm Mortipede. So, if this one just, said for every creature that leaves your graveyard it gets +1/+0, Menace and Lifelink, then if you had an effect that exiled your whole graveyard at once, then this could get like +10 power all at the same time. That would be a different conversation. That would be interesting. As the card is written, you have to do them one by one. And that means that this probably doesn't have any constructed application. You would basically need to turn this on every single turn, right? So it was constantly a 4/4 Menace Lifelinker. For this to have any real shot at seeing Standard play. It would also be good if you could do it on the opponent's turn, so it could gain lifelink on blocking. If you can figure out how to do all of that, then maybe there's a deck that would want it, but I'm going to call it pretty unlikely. Slimy Dual Leech. This is a good, solid card in Limited. Makes a small creature of yours, power 2 or less, get +1/+0 and Death Touch until end of turn. It's aggressive in Limited. In Constructed, the rate is just too far below what we would expect to be seeing. Soul Innervation. I could almost see a case for this card in Standard. It's a lot of mana to pay. It is at instant speed. It doesn't size up well against cards like Sholdred. So if a creature has more efficient toughness than mana, this won't kill it. But there's the other side of the card, where if creatures are leaving your graveyard, the opponent loses 1, you gain 1. And if you can use both sides of the card, then I'd say maybe you could build a deck that actually wants the Soul Innervation. It probably doesn't get there, but there's a little bit of interest here with having, this enchantment that sticks around and drains the opponent. Agency Coroner is just too expensive. Too expensive for constructed. Deadly Cover-Up, this is good. I feel like everyone has been forgetting that there's a battle in black that sweeps the board for 6 mana. And I know it's hard to get to 6 mana, but there's like a pirate that when it dies makes a treasure token and stuff. There are ways you could ramp your mana a little bit even in black. So I feel like that battle is not seeing as much play as it probably should have. But now we have a 5 mana sweeper. And that is a world of difference from 6. I know there are times I have died with a Farewell in my hand, wishing that I had a cheaper board sweeper. So Deadly Cover-Up will serve you well. And then there's this Collect Evidence 6 part, and this card is wild to me for not specifying that it doesn't hit basic lands. That's absolutely wild to me, and I feel like at some point down the road, this card's either going to have to either receive errata or get a banning. Who knows, maybe it'll be fine. Maybe no one cares that it can exile all the basics out of a deck. But it's something that cards have not done up to this point. Or there was even one recently that could hit basics, but it only did up to 4 of them. This one can hit all of them. That's pretty wild to me. But that aside, it's a mode you don't need in order to use it as a sweeper. It is a perfectly fine sweeper without the evidence. With the evidence, you get to take a look at the opponent's hand. You get to get rid of an annoying card that they're using. And if they were like a synergy combo deck, then you might really trip them up. If they were relying on a card like Breach the Multiverse or something, and you just remove all of them, then they could be in trouble. It doesn't add up. This is a 5 mana instant. Return a creature from your graveyard to the battlefield, suspect it. So the creature cannot block for you because it'll be suspected. However, it's an instant speed reanimator spell. It's not the only one we have in standard. I think there's one that reanimates something and it comes into play tapped. Or I think there's another one that can be done at instant speed if you meet the clauses on the card. This could see play. I could actually imagine a deck wanting to do this at the end of the opponent's turn, bring back something with Menace, especially if it's like something with lifelink, like Atraxa. You can just get in there and you don't care if it blocks because you're, racing with lifelink. So, it's not impossible this card could see play. There's just a whole lot of different ways to reanimate things in Standard right now. So this one's not super competitive, but it's fine. Polygraph Orb. This is too expensive, but let's break it down. So 5 mana. Artifact. Uncommon. When it ETBs, look at the top 4 cards of your library. Put 2 into your hand. The others in your graveyard, you lose 2 life. So, okay. First up, you get the best 2 cards out of 4. Send the others to the graveyard. All of that's got some value. It does make you lose 2 life. If this was an instant, as an instant, it should probably cost about 3 mana to do that card draw effect. In fact, I think we have some cards that are like that at 3 mana at instant speed. This one's 5 mana at sorcery speed. So what else does it do? You can pay 2 and tap, collect evidence 3, and each opponent loses 3 life unless they discard a card or sacrifice a creature. So, I hate how mana intensive this card is. By the time you've paid 5 to get this on the battlefield, it should probably say tap, collect evidence 3, not pay 2 and tap. If it was just tap, collect evidence 3, I could almost imagine using this card. I really could. You know, if it didn't cost 2 to activate, I could imagine trying to build around it. But not at the point that it costs this much mana, even as an ongoing cost. You know, it could have been an interesting enabler for collect evidence decks in Standard if such a thing were going to exist. You know, a way to pressure the opponent's life total, pressure their resources, puts cards in your graveyard, keeps getting you forward in the game. But at this much mana, it's basically garbage. It's unplayable in Limited for the most part, and it seems unplayable in Constructed too. I like the art. I like the concept. You know, as far as just like the text that's written on the card here, I think it's pretty neat. You know, if it costs like 3 to get down and 2 in tap, that would be one thing. Or if it costs 5 to get down and it was just tap without the 2, that would be interesting. But as it is, I just I don't think it can get there probably. Undercity Eliminator. I think this could probably see Standard play. So this is 1 more mana than the original Ravenous Chupacabra, which was, you know, 2/2 for 2 ETBs, destroy target creature. Now this one is 1 more mana. It is a point bigger. It's a 3/3 for 5 instead of a 2/2 for 4. And it's got an extra clause, and that is tripping it up a little bit. You have to sacrifice an artifact or creature. So it doesn't just, you know, exile something. But it comes down, you sacrifice an artifact or creature, and when you do, you exile a creature an opponent controls. Exile's even better than killing it. So it needs food. That's the problem. But it is not difficult at all to make a deck that has blood tokens and clues and treasure and map tokens and various other things, power stones. There are so many token artifacts we can have access to right now. And I know 5 mana is a lot, but if you're adding to the board and taking your opponent's best thing off the board, that's probably good enough. I mean, seriously, it's probably good enough. I think this card's playable. Basilica Stalker is fine in Limited. It's okay there. It's just too much mana for Constructed. It's all there is to say, really. Persuasive Interrogators. Neat card. You know, if you could trick it into play, or you got some kind of a grindy clue control deck, and this is like a win condition. Like, okay, let's say you got a white-black deck, and it's like a control deck. You got sweepers and removal and stuff. And at some point in the game, you set up a board state where you got 5 clues. You get down Bartolome, who can sacrifice artifacts to gain counters, and you get the Persuasive Interrogators. and you just go full control, respond to your own triggers from Bartolome, sacrifice the 5 clues, and the opponent gets 10 poison counters and loses the game. Not impossible. Unlikely. And that's a pretty narrow deck we're describing. I mean, it is like a 5-6 that replaces itself. It could help out a poison strategy a little bit, but unless this is somehow specifically the win con of your deck, then it probably doesn't see any standard play. Vein Ripper is pretty nasty. So it's a 6/5 flyer for 6. Ward, sacrifice a creature, which feeds into its ability of whenever a creature dies, you drain the opponent for 2. So even like the floor of this card is you play it, they lose a creature, they spend a removal spell, and they get drained out for 2. And that's the best case scenario for the opponent. If they can't hit the ward, they could be in trouble. Because the damage from this card can add up very quickly. It's extremely deadly. It could be especially bad if, you know, the opponent's like tapped out, you drop a Vein Ripper, attack with a bunch of little guys, then they're kind of, you know, damned if you do, damned if you don't. Just let the damage through and take it, or make blocks and trades and things and get drained for everyone that dies, including their creatures that die. That's a nasty card for sure. Slice from the Shadows. It's interesting that it can't be countered. Probably too expensive for constructed. We already have some black and X removal spells. One of them gains you life, and you can exile cards to, you know, pay 2 mana worth of X. That's the Black March. There's also Black Sun's Twilight, which if you pay enough mana can reanimate a creature from your graveyard. And then there's this thing, which is probably not as good as either of those. Outrageous Robbery. I think this card is amazing. This is a mill win condition, which might be a little slow, right? It's not mill as a win condition that's as fast as like Jace's or some of the other cards that are normal in the mill deck. This one's slower, but still, if you tap out at the end of the opponent's turn and exile the top 7 cards of their library, not only do you have a new hand of cards from the opponent's deck, but you've basically ensured that they're going to mill out before you do that game. And, a second copy of Outrageous Robbery is just, another nail in the coffin at that point. Or a third, or a fourth. So I think that this card can absolutely do work. Being instant speed makes all the difference in the world. It's so nice that it's instant speed. So, yeah, and then you can use manas that are mana of any color. I think this is a phenomenal card. Just can't go into just any deck, but probably mid-range control and ramp could all find uses for it. I think it's really cool. Alright, Sanguine Savior could be flipped up with just black if you play it for disguise. It's interesting in that you could have a double lifelink attack on a turn. That could be a pretty big swing in the game. However, this just being a 2/1 lifelinker at that point that you've sunk 5 mana in on, it's probably not good enough. Fairy Snoop, this can technically draw you a card in a mono black deck. It's slow. It's very slow, and there are easier ways to draw cards in black. So I really don't think this gets there. Shady Informant, this is too much mana for constructed. It is interesting that when it dies, it deals 2 to any target. So it can kind of trade up, or at least at parity for its mana cost, but it's too expensive, really. Breaker Scoundrel is way too expensive to consider for mono black, where the only way you can flip it up is for 6. Even if you had the access to green, 3/3 Death Toucher's alright, but you got better things to do with your time and mana. Black can do both sides of push and pull. And if you want to do the pull side, then I think this could be good enough to see play in Constructed. Animating 2 creatures from a single graveyard, this could win the game. This could win the game in one fell swoop. For example, there's like a 10 mana creature in green. It's one of the prototypes, so it's like an artifact. It's like an 8/8 for 10, and when it ETBs, you untap a land you control, which also becomes an 8/8 with haste. And this would give the other one haste, which means that one card by itself would be like 16 damage with pull. And then you have another creature you can also pull back at the same time. Right? That I can imagine ways you can get to 20 damage off of doing a pull. Which means, if you want the pull side of the card, you also get the push. Push isn't amazing, but it's serviceable. It's 2 mana removal. You will use it. So, could this see constructed play? Absolutely. If you're a Reanimator deck, and you want to try to punch the opponent out in a single go, then yeah, you could do it with pull. Cease and Desist, black can only cast the Cease side of the card by itself, which you exile up to 2 target cards from a single graveyard, you gain 2 life and draw a card. You got better ways of exiling stuff from their graveyard. Not getting access to the Desist side if you're just mono black wouldn't be worth it. Flotsam and Jetsam, you only get access to the Jetsam side of this card. It is interesting, though. You mill the opponent for 3, and then you can cast a spell from the opponent's graveyard without paying its mana cost. Depending on who you're fighting, that could be really, really good. But it's very swingy. I don't think it's something I'd just pull out in best of 1. Because your hits are not going to be very good if you're up against, like, mono red, mono white, quick little Boros tokens deck. You're not going to get great hits off of them. So, if you thought Jetsam was possibly good enough to be seeing play, it would be like a sideboard card for best of 3. And then, if you're up against a Reanimator deck, something like that, yeah, you could maybe consider Jetsam. I think it's too expensive, even there. Especially if you don't get the Flotsam side of the card. But it's interesting. It's not nothing. Alright, that brings us to the end of black. Let me pick some things to craft here. More board sweepers are always useful in the collection. It's a card that unlocks the control archetype for you. Without board sweepers, it's really difficult to piece together a control deck as a new player. So if you like that kind of play, then it's worth your time to collect up some board sweepers along the way. Outrageous Robbery just seemed like such a fun card to me. I'm very happy to craft my 3rd copy here. I'm curious to see what Case of the Stashed Skeleton can do. A creature that can't block is not great, but the payoff on this card of getting a Demonic Tutor Seems very good. So I'm willing to craft a second copy and see what it can do. The Mythic has been decided for me. I opened a whole playset of Vein Rippers, along with, some limited play. So it's going to be a second copy of Massacre Girl. And I don't mind. I don't know if she's going to get there, but she is a neat card. I like handing out Wither to all my creatures. Alright, let's do this thing. Alright, so join me next time. We'll be looking at red. Then we'll go on to green and finally wrap up with multicolor. Like and subscribe. Please check out all my other videos. It helps the channel a lot. And never stop honing your critical thinking and empathy.